I'm Chris Saha. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-director of the Global Observatory. Really pleased to have all of you here to join us on this, I think, really exciting discussion building on the theme of cosmopolitan ethics and specifically getting perspectives from outside of the science on what we mean by cosmopolitan ethics, how could we achieve that that goal, and what implications would that have for this type of emerging research in the life sciences. So the format today will be, again, like the previous panel, about 5 to 10 minutes of short remarks from each of our distinguished panelists, followed by a discussion with you, the audience. So first, we have Professor Rosemarie Garland-Thomson from Emory University. She is a humanist, a disability, justice, and culture thought leader, bioethicist, educator, and broad scholar in critical disability studies. And secondly, we have Professor Reuven Brandt, who's a philosopher here at the University of California, San Diego. His research focuses on the ethical and legal questions pertaining to assisted reproduction, reproductive ethics, and a focus on acquisition and distribution of rights and responsibility in complex reproductive arrangements. And lastly, but not least, we have Professor J. Ben Hurlbut from the Arizona State University. He is a STS scholar and has written several books, including Experiments in Democracy, Human Embryo Research, and the Politics of Bioethics. And we will start off first with Professor Garland-Thomson.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and engage in these really interesting discussions. Chris had, in planning our session here, had sent some questions around, and I wanted to respond to one element of his question, and that is, how can we develop cosmopolitan ethics? And in relation to how we develop cosmopolitan ethics, his question was, what perspectives might be silenced in the public conversations about cosmopolitan ethics, and what accounts might be dominant and universalizing? And that's what I wanted to respond to somewhat here today. So I want to make several points. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about what cosmopolitan ethics might be. Generally, it's understood that cosmopolitan ethics is based on the idea that all human beings have equal moral status across societies, and I would assume across time. So this idea of equal moral status is a very important one and a rather modern one. And the ensuring of equal moral status through public conversations, regulations, laws, covenants, practices, is what I would like to talk a little bit about today, what kinds of public conversations we have that will help us as a community of human beings assure that all people are recognized as having equal moral status. And I'm particularly interested in how we implement equality in practices and policies in relation to people with disabilities. So I work in disability studies. I identify as a person with a disability, someone with a genetic condition. So I come from a certain amount of patient expertise or within the community here. So I'm a bioethicist as well as a patient, which is an interesting place to be. and that's where my perspective comes. People with disabilities, I think, have had a difficult time, and it has been difficult in modern societies to recognize and to implement full equality for people with disabilities, and that's one of the things I would like to focus on. There are many public conversations that exist that support inequality or support what might be called differential equality for people with disabilities. Sometimes we call that the history of eugenics, the idea that some people have a higher moral status based on human differences that we sometimes think of as illness or disability or hereditary inferiority. And of course, that has a long, deep history. Some examples of that in a post-Holocaust and post-World War II world might be some of the utilitarian philosophers, such as the philosopher Peter Singer, who has asked questions about whether parents should be able to morally and legally euthanize their disabled newborns if they don't want to have those disabled newborns. This is a bit of a provocation, but nonetheless, it's a question that endures. Julian Savulescu, the utilitarian philosopher, has proposed something he calls procreative beneficence, and by that he means that parents should have the moral obligation to use any particular or any kind of genetic selection treatment in order to produce children who have what he calls the best chance to have the best life. We can talk a little bit more about these philosophical positions, but these are just examples of the kinds of conversations that suggest that there is not moral or political equality between people who have disabilities and people who understood themselves and are understood as being people who are non-disabled or fully normal. Also, of course, there is a great deal of commercial genetic technology development, including testing, that would identify a wide range of conditions prenatally that might be examined for evaluation, and decisions might be made by prospective families about what kinds of people they want to bring into the world. So these are very controversial questions that, of course, have been brought up again recently in public conversations with the Dobbs decision that came down from the Supreme Court, which restricts, of course, abortion, and with that, of course, the logics and practice of selective testing and termination. And I don't think it's very profitable for us to discuss that particularly, but what I do want to talk about is the kinds of attitudes and the kinds of conversations in the public that shape our understanding of the kinds of lives that people with disabilities actually lead. So there is also a very robust, starting in the mid-20th century, public conversation that comes from civil and human rights movements and that counters the kind of utilitarian thought and philosophy that I mentioned, that we see, that we think of often as a kind of eugenic understanding of human variation. And these civil and human rights movements have given us a whole apparatus of treaties and covenants and laws ranging in the United States, say from the Americans with Disabilities Act, internationally to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and of course the entire human and civil rights set of treaties that the United Nations has brought forward, starting in 1948 with the UN Convention on Human Rights. And the implementation of these various treaties and these various laws has dramatically increased the opportunities for people with disabilities and the implementation of equality for people with disabilities by restructuring all sorts of arrangements in the built environment and all sorts of desegregation practices. So this human and civil rights initiative and public conversation has countered the utilitarian more or less eugenic set of attitudes and practices and public conversations that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm giving you a rather oversimplified narrative here because of the time limit. What I would like to end with presenting is the work in healthcare ethics that has been put forward by a number of scholars and people who work in healthcare. And that is the idea of developing training and curriculum for healthcare workers in disability cultural competence. And this has been put forward by a number of people, but my colleague at Harvard, who is the physician and person with multiple sclerosis, Lisa Isioni, has published 2 studies in healthcare affairs. And these 2 recent studies, just within the last couple of years, have suggested that doctors are uncomfortable with having patients with disabilities, in part because they really don't know how to approach and treat people with disabilities, and they are then reluctant to often have patients who are people with disabilities. That's what the first study revealed. The second study also suggested that doctors in general don't know very much about human and civil rights legislation in terms of people with disabilities. They also don't know very much about the legal rights of people with disabilities or how people with disabilities can request accommodations. And again, this creates a certain discomfort amongst physicians. And so in response to these 2 rather limited studies, Lisa and many others of us have proposed that curriculum development in showing that would draw from the arts and culture to put forward stories about people with disabilities who actually have very high quality of life and who actually have been able to flourish with disabilities that are generally understood as the kinds of conditions that create suffering and disadvantage and reduce quality of life. And so one of the things that we are trying to think through is how we can develop this curriculum, how training can be brought forward for healthcare workers that might help them better understand that living with disabilities and flourishing can be achieved in life, and that having a disability itself or an illness does not itself necessarily compromise quality of life. So I will stop there. I had a few other examples, but I think we can have some conversations about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Reuven, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm very pleased to be here today. One of the, I guess, the series of questions we were asked to reflect on for today were about sort of the role and responsibility of institutions in fostering public engagement in science, technology, and governance. How the role institutions might play in fostering participation and also in developing a kind of cosmopolitan ethics. There was a third question, which was about the barriers that scientists face. I'm not a scientist, so I don't feel qualified to answer that question, but I want to sort of focus on those other two, cosmopolitan ethics and the role of public engagement in science and the governance of science and technology. And I think to properly answer and address that question, we have to sort of take a half step back and ask ourselves, why do we want public involvement in the governance of science and technology in the first place? Or perhaps another way to think of this question is, what is the appropriate role of public involvement in the governance of science and technology? And I think that one tempting answer might be something like this. Ethical questions are really hard. If we look around society, there's lots of disagreement about what we ought to do around a particular question. And disagreement is rife. It's hard to know how to adjudicate between competing views. A natural solution might be that we live in a democratic society, and thus we ought to settle questions about morality, about which there's lots of disagreement, through democratic means. And one way to do this might be consulting the public. If we go and find out what public opinion is, this would be reasonable guidance about where we ought to draw limits and how we ought to proceed. So we might think that consulting the public is a way for scientists to find out where the ethical boundaries actually lie, because these boundaries are in fact determined by public opinion. And I want to suggest that we should resist that view, okay, as obvious as that view might seem. And that's simply because public opinion is not a reliable guide to right and wrong, and is in fact often mistaken. And I think we can see some clear examples of this, right? Slavery is wrong even in a society where it's popular. Misogynistic policies that deny women access to education are wrong even in societies where such views have popular support. So popularity, public opinion is not going to be a guide to what's right and wrong. Okay, so now you might think, well, I'm going to thus conclude that we shouldn't be consulting with the public, but that's not so. I think there are other reasons we can give for why consulting public opinion is in fact crucially important. So the alternate view, and the one that I think is correct, and I'm going to try and argue for briefly now, is that public consultation is important for figuring out how scientific and technological developments might impact other people and society more generally. And this is just because, well, not just because, but it's a psychological fact, I think, that it's hard for individuals to imagine how a particular advancement or a particular technology might impact people that are very different from themselves. We're sort of limited in our own ability to imagine the consequences that might follow from technological developments, especially for those whose lives, values, and cultures are very different from our own. So without listening to the concerns of other people, we risk making the mistake that our own experience is representative of everyone's, and it isn't. And this might lead us to completely overlook matters of serious moral concern because they simply lie outside our scope of experience. So yeah, it might be hard to anticipate how technological developments may impact others whose lives and priorities are different from our own. And I think we can think of some concrete examples, right? So we might think, so we can imagine technology that allows people to learn the likely sex of an embryo at very early stages of development. An initial view of this kind of technology might be something like, well, more information is an unmitigated good. This is always a great thing to have. How could knowing more be bad? But the existence of such technology might harm people who face social or cultural pressure to create male children, right? We might have people who, the existence of this technology allows for people to be pressured into unwanted abortions, for example, so they can try again for male offspring. And in fact, the question about sex-selective abortion has garnered much ethical attention and might not be something that's easy to foresee, depending on where your starting point is. But through consulting with the public, when we start thinking about new technologies or scientific developments, we might gain better insight into what the consequences might be. So I think if you accept this, the second version of why consulting with the public is important, this might change our view about what we ought to be doing and what strategies we should be taking when we are trying to consult with the public. So for one, it's not going to be a numbers game. It's not going to be about getting the most people into a room and taking a poll about what people think about a particular matter. What's going to be key is diversity. We want to hear from people who are different from us, so we can try and anticipate what consequences a development might have. So I think with that in mind, we can start to look at what responsibilities institutions might have to make this happen. So for one, it's going to be very important to make information about scientific and technological developments accessible to a broad range of people. This means presenting information in a way that's not full of jargon, that's accessible. It's also going to mean allowing for diverse ways of engaging. Not everybody can come in the middle of the day to a lecture in a university hall. If we want to reach a diverse group of people, we need to find ways to make it easy for people to participate. And there are some models of how to do this. Like, for instance, in the UK, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority often sends out sort of requests for information or views from the public and allows people to write in what concerns they might have. And then this gets assessed when people are thinking about how to govern a particular technological development. And I think these are sort of positive steps we can take. The last thing I want to talk about is just the idea of cosmopolitan ethics. And I think there are a few ways we can think about cosmopolitan ethics. One way I think is perfectly good, and one way is a bit problematic. When we talk about cosmopolitan ethics, sometimes people think what we're talking about is giving equal importance to each individual's view about the substance of morality. And based on sort of what I said earlier, I think that's the wrong way to go, because people can be mistaken about the substance of morality. This can be based on factual claims that are incorrect or moral beliefs that are pernicious. I think the focus of cosmopolitan ethics has to be treating individuals with equal dignity and respect as persons. And again, this is not something that's going to necessarily be achieved through just the practice of democracy or democratizing values. It's going to involve trying to attract a broad range of diverse voices and sitting down and doing some serious and difficult ethical thinking about how we ought to proceed. And that second step, I think, is not something that can just be sort of done solely through the public. And of course, how to do that is a difficult question, and we can talk about that later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ben, you're next.
So when we, the organizers, were drafting the questions for this panel, I never imagined that I would have to answer them. But this chair was supposed to be occupied by our beloved colleague, John Evans, who had to be called away for a family emergency. So unfortunately, I'm having to fill in and respond to my own challenge. And since the project of this panel is to ask some questions to engender a conversation around this kind of, nice sounding but difficult to wrap your head around concept of cosmopolitan ethics. What I want to do is just offer a few thoughts, less about what it is and more about to respond to the question about the accounts that dominate, and I would add to that delimit, what is sort of inimical to the forms of engagement and deliberation that draw upon the full richness of human moral imagination and experience and invite it in and engage it collectively with humility, which is what I take the project of cosmopolitan ethics to be. So I'm going to take a page out of Matt Porteous's book and have four things, but I'm going to do them one better, and they're all going to start with the same letter. So my first item is imperative. So I think one of the barriers to achieving the kind of to achieving a cosmopolitan ethics is the ways in which there maybe is a tendency, particularly in the kinds of conversations one has in the sorts of domains that we're in confusing a kind of imperative to progress with an imperative to research. And I think that came up a bit on the earlier panel today. The notion that, to overstate it and put it simply, that if you can do it, you should do it. That, it's that research has a kind of intrinsic virtue unless one can give reasons as to why it ought not proceed, as opposed to seeing the domain of science and technology as a zone of immense potential in which judgments are made about where one's energy and resources and so forth are put more productively versus less productively. Just to point to one example, the issue of the 14-day rule came up with respect to human embryo research culture, indeed, there is an emerging conversation around whether that limit is an appropriate limit. But I want to just point to the way that as it became technically possible to culture human embryos up to and past that limit, the limit became much more flimsy, which is quite odd for a limit which was laid down in order to constrain research practice, right? So here are just a few quotes taken from places like Science and Nature. These technical developments raise the question of where to place the ethical limits on human embryo development in vitro. That's a statement by a very prominent developmental biologist. These advances put human developmental biology on a collision course with the 14-day rule. The rule is no longer fit for purpose because of the technical capacity to cross it, and there is building pressure to extend or even abolish this rule. There is something in that construction of progress as the imperative to research that makes presumptive a kind of technological trajectory or a scientific and technological trajectory that is the product of human and social choices and commitments. And whether those are good or bad commitments, of course, those are questions to be asked. And yet, what I want to point to is the way that those questions tend to be constrained by the presumption that X development raises the problem. X development will push past, whatever limit one imposes. So closely related to that is my second I, which is inevitability. And if one listens to the kind of discourse that happens around biotechnologies, you'll note how the word inevitability does tend to come up here and there. Well, it's inevitable that such and such will happen. Now that this step has been taken, now that that technique has been developed, it's inevitable that it will be applied in such and such way. Just for example, in early 2015, when discussions around heritable genome editing were just sort of really getting going, Nature Biotechnology did a kind of interview of a whole bunch of experts in the field, bioethicists, scientists, et cetera. And the first question was basically, do you think now that this technology is developed that it's inevitable that it will be applied to the human germline? After the news from China of the genetically engineered babies emerged, there were headlines that said, well, it was an inevitable result of the development of it. It was inevitable that this was going to be applied. Sometimes the undertone was it was inevitable it was going to be applied in China. Well, that last point is actually quite important because the narrative of inevitability, once the technology exists, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, the future is beyond our control, et cetera, often is linked to a kind of geopolitics of governance. Well, we might restrain ourselves here, but someone somewhere else is going to do it. And therefore, what's the point of restraining ourselves? Maybe we should just do it, but do it better than they would do it, because otherwise, we're just taking ourselves out of the game because it's inevitable. So that this notion of inevitability has this delimiting role on the kinds of questions that can be asked about what should or shouldn't be done, the kinds of conversations that can be had about governance. Number three is, and here's where I really want to channel John Evans, is illegitimacy. So at the end of the third summit, during the final panel, the Q&A session of the final panel of the first International Summit on Gene Editing in 2015, John stood up, went to the mic. He might not like it that I'm saying this, repeating this, but nevertheless, he got up and went to the mic and he observed, I've been sitting here listening for 3 days and the word religion hasn't been mentioned once. And yet, he's a sociologist of religion, of American religion. He says for more than half of the country, the way more than 50% of Americans would think about this would be in some way or other related to religious perspectives. Where is it? Andy, can you pop that slide up for me? So I just want to show one picture. This is from the cover of, since we're in California, this is this is the cover of the Stanford Medical Alumni Association magazine, Stanford Medicine magazine, something like September 2004, fall 2004, just at the time that Californians were voting on Proposition 71, which funded CERM and so on and so forth. This is sort of moment of high politics of the stem cell battle. I don't know if you can make out the picture, but here you have, a sort of diverse group of scientists on one side, then this lined up along the sort of battle lines with this army of Bible-thumping preacher clones. And this was the representation of what was one of the major political and bioethical controversies of the moment in the United States. Okay, what did this do? Well, this constructed a sort of picture of basically illegitimate politics and the ways in which those illegitimate politics ran afoul of science. And I would say that, CERM came into being as a result of that initiative. It has done many things. One of the most durable consequences, one of the most durable outcomes of that moment is that, in a sense, by constructing the public problem in these terms, we got a public problem that looked like this. So the ways in which legitimacy or illegitimacy of even what questions one can ask, of participation in the discussion, of what the prerequisites are, what one needs to know, what views one needs to check, what vocabulary, moral vocabulary one needs to employ, etc. What the sort of rules of debate, the terms of debate that are insisted upon in simple images like this, simple representations like this, are actually where a lot of the action is. Right? It's not about getting to the point of the starting line. I mean, this is the result. This is this. So thinking about the ways in which the legitimacy or illegitimacy of deliberation and of its terms are constructed seems to me an absolutely essential place to attend to, if in the name of seeking after a more humble and more open and more inclusive and richer dialogue. Okay, the last one, and then I'll quit, is internationalism. Or I'm cheating a little on this one because I want to put a different letter word in front of it, and that is a kind of false internationalism. The way in which the international gets invoked often, the international summits, the International Commission on Germline, the International Society for Stem Cell Research, the international this, the international that. Jacob made this comment earlier, the ways in which different societies come at problems differently with different cultural traditions, different legal traditions, and those are rich and important traditions. And that if one elevates oneself to the position of the international and speaks for the international, there is an appropriation of sorts that's potentially taking place there. And I think that the thing to attend to in that context are the ways in which a presumptive universalism of scientific expertise, a presumptive sort of deterritoriality of scientific expertise, it floats above place, right? It occupies a different sphere, gets then equated with a kind of presumptive internationalism and displaces a world which is much more heterogeneous, much more complex, and much more full of experience, imagination, and knowledge than tends to be acknowledged by a 15-member commission that slaps the label international on itself, but is mostly populated by molecular biologists trained at US institutions.
All right, thank you, Ben. I think we heard three really fascinating accounts of and critiques of cosmopolitan ethics. I'll start off with a question. I think as many scientists that I've heard from in my field think of and characterize ethics as being punitive in some ways. There's a set of check boxes. It's mostly to satisfy, and if you don't check, then you might get in trouble, and in some cases, serious trouble. I wonder if cosmopolitan ethics could be generative, and I think we heard stories of having diversity and not just polling, hearing from different disciplines, scholars, like Rosemarie pointed out towards the end, and then, international, just to pick up on your last point. So maybe you could reflect, each of you, on how you see an opportunity here for this type of ethics, a different kind perhaps, to be attending to some of the questions, the hard questions that we heard about this morning.
I think I suggested that we could work toward new kinds of knowledge, which is to say new kinds of stories. Medical science promotes and prefers a particular kind of knowledge. And that knowledge is not usually narrative knowledge. It's not usually stories about human beings and their lives lived. And I think putting forward those kinds of human stories to change the story is an important thing to try to do. And this, of course, is what the humanities and the arts does in general, and culture does in general. But narrative knowledge is closer to the human experience of actually lived lives. And so to increase the amount of narrative knowledge, in other words, the stories of lives lived, and to figure out a way to do that, I think is really an important counter to the predominance of a certain kind of what I call counting and measuring knowledge, that is the kind of knowledge that medicine and science tends to privilege. So that's one answer.
Yeah, so I think if we take seriously the idea that we ought to treat everybody with sort of equal dignity and respect, I think that can be generative in the sense that it'll help set, I think, interesting project goals and help us think about creative ways we might be able to use technology or developments that arose just out of curiosity. And I think we've seen some examples of this. So I think, the scientific community's response to the COVID epidemic was amazing in the way that there was an incredible amount of collaboration. And that's opened up a pathway to develop vaccines, hopefully, for communities that have been traditionally underserved by vaccine development. So I think, so to move away from this checkbox ethics, right, as my research complying with everything it ought to, and to think, how can this research be used if I'm really trying to do good in the world? It can open up other opportunities where I think science and technology can stand to really benefit humanity.
So we had a little bit of discussion in the last panel about public fear. But I was thinking as I was listening to that discussion that the sort of corollary to that is public hope, right? And while there is a very great wariness of public fear within sort of the basic domains of scientific practice, your research, your funding might get shut down, they might, whatever. There's an enormous openness and encouragement of public hope, right? And that I think is very important and is very valuable so long as it's not instrumentalized in the following sense. Science and technology are products of enlightenment. I mean, they are what enlightened societies, they are part of what enlightened societies do as expressions of enlightenment and of progress. And yet they should be embedded in, and thus subsidiary to the collectively envisioned and articulated ideas of the good that should animate them. They ideally should be expressions of them. And insofar as, the comments about sickle cell earlier and the sort of hope that one can have because of the work that people like Matt are doing, that one should not think about that merely in the sort of instrumental terms. It's great that there's a Matt because he can produce products that will be beneficial for people, but rather in the human terms that there is an undertaking here, which is undertaken in the name of responding to human suffering and bettering human lives. But what it means to respond to suffering and what it means to better lives and what forms of suffering do not warrant a response, and what sorts of lives ought not be changed. What are the interventions in lives that are beneficial and good and what aren't? These are questions that belong to a collective. And so it seems to me that the idea of a cosmopolitan ethics that invites that begins with the recognition that valuing life is the first step, and then what that means for any given domain of practice is the second one, instead of the other way around, is an enormously hopeful and aspirational orientation. And that, one of the challenges in this domain is for this domain to get outside of itself and recognize, I think as those comments suggested, it begins with people and it begins with lives lived, as Rosemarie was suggesting. And it only comes into the domains of the extraordinary power of science and technology in response to that, or it should.
Very interesting. Maybe I'll take this in a direction and build off of this fear I think that Matt pointed out earlier about a tech bro in Silicon Valley maybe using some of these human embryos or these types of bioengineering techniques to make a personalized product. But and let's say there's a cosmopolitan ethics or some sort of community out there that says, the right to do that is not absolute, that there should be some limits to that type of processing of and manipulation of human life. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of where you see power and conflict in these types of situations, and how it intersects with these ideas of cosmopolitan ethics that we just heard about. So let's focus in on that example in, let's say, in California, since we're here. Okay. And that was proposed, let's say, next week. What do you think a robust discussion or process of deliberating on that case would be?
Do I have to take that?
You're the Californian, aren't you?
It's true. I'm a recovering Californian. I don't honestly, Chris, have a very good prescriptive answer to that question, and it seems to me that once we drop down into the zone of identifying the procedures, we've also ended up in that zone of delimitation that I think Matt was partly pointing to with his first item of sort of soft governance, which was delimited governance, what the Biosafety Committee says, what the IRB says, and so forth. But it does seem to me that that a starting point that wants to draw a distinction between, well, science and politics, and for that matter, ethics and politics, that wants to talk about politicization in as though it's a pollution, as opposed to that mode of human coexistence through which we seek after ways of being together, which itself is an expression of being human. I think that we're sort of already off on the wrong foot. And so, I think I even slightly disagree with the suggestion that the purpose of the reason for a diversity of perspectives is that you arrive at better answers, as though that's a sort of epistemic achievement, like more knowledge means more. But rather, that may be the case, but that the conditions of possibility for having a moral community are that the community recognizes itself as a moral community and takes itself seriously in those terms, which means taking seriously those moral perspectives that are present in one's community, even if one really rejects those particular perspectives. And so, it's bizarre that I find it easier to get to that place in my undergraduate seminar than in most of the sort of rarefied zones of bioethics and bioscience governance, where that's supposed to be what the thing is all about.
I'm finding myself drawn toward a metaphor it's a familiar metaphor that the ship is going through the ocean and it's very hard to turn the ship around once it's headed in a certain direction. And I'm thinking about conversations that we've had about how the pandemic created a border which changed the way we had to think about almost everything. and how difficult it is to conceptualize going back before the pandemic to the place where we were when we didn't know what a pandemic was going to do and that it was going to come to us. And I wanted to bring up the idea of, or the case study, if you will, of Down syndrome. So Down syndrome was the first genetic condition that was tested for widely starting in the mid-1960s. And in the mid-1960s, life prospects and quality of life for people born with Down syndrome was very, very low, in part because the recommendation was generally that people born with Down syndrome should be institutionalized, and also because that there wasn't a very good development of the kinds of treatments that could address some of the medical problems that people born with Down syndrome had. And so the genetic test was introduced into the reproductive environment for Down syndrome, and it has stayed in place, not as a requirement, although some places in a requirement, but as a kind of accepted practice since the mid-1960s. And in fact, the prospects for a good life and flourishing for people born into rich countries with Down syndrome now is very, very different than it was in the 1960s, and yet we still persist in the same sense of the practice of testing and termination on the basis of a risk for Down syndrome, so that worldwide, the elimination of people with Down syndrome is between 80 and 95%. Recently, some of the Nordic countries had announced that they had eliminated the disease of Down syndrome. And of course, the way they're doing that is by eliminating people who have this condition, as if the disease and the condition, as if the person and the condition are not, or are separable in some way. And so this is just one example of some of the assumptions and the practices that are in place that go unexamined because they are part of the general protocol and part of the general narrative that we have. Nonetheless, of course, what I don't want to suggest is that reproductive liberty or reproductive autonomy is not a really important right in liberal democracies. Everyone should have the right to determine the kind of family that they want to have. That's really very clear. So what we have here is the story that I just told about Down syndrome and the story of the importance of autonomy, especially autonomy in creating families and lives. And these come into conflict all the time in practice and in public conversations. And so it's very complicated, and it goes way beyond simple recommendations or positions about what ought to be legal and what ought to be illegal, what ought to be understood as ethical and what ought to be understood as unethical. And I've just given one example of how complicated it is and why it's so important for us to have multiple voices and public conversations about such questions that involve, in the broadest sense, cosmopolitan ethics.
Thank you, Rosemarie. I think that's a fantastic story to share on a pretty pointed question. Let's open it up. I think, are there some mics around? I would welcome questions from the audience on any of the comments we heard earlier today. And I guess while we're waiting for mics, I'll ask, maybe I'll pick up on this question of soft versus hard decisions and or actual limits, right, that we touched upon in panel 1, and how these stories that may not have simple answers, as you just pointed out, or operate in a very complex culture, how can we still have and adhere to limits like the 14-day rule that really do provide hard guideposts that allow us to do some of the science that and is emancipatory for the types of questions that a particular field of research wants to do, like in embryo research?
So can I just answer that quickly by not answering it myself, but quoting the Warnock report, which I mean, I think the 14-day limit is a very interesting thing. We could spend all day talking about it, in part because it was a soft determination of a hard limit. Like, the rationale was not 14 days is obviously the right place, at least not in the British version of that determination. It's more complicated over here, but rather that a determination was needed. So this is from the Warnock report. The establishing a limit is, quote, witness to the existence of a moral order of our society. There must be some barriers that are not to be crossed, some limits fixed, beyond which people must not be allowed to go. The very existence of morality depends upon it. I mean, I think that's quite a provocative and interesting statement, since it's a statement about the moral order and not a statement about embryos, right? It's a statement about limits that recognizes that limits are not merely about the thing that they limit, whether it's the biological entity or the scientific practice around it, but is a commitment to the recognition of moral ambiguity, and thus of a kind of ethical imperative to draw a line for the sake of having a line, for the sake of being able to say, this is a responsible and civilized society that won't go just anywhere and do just anything.
Would you like to add?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree. I think that it's a mischaracterization to say that these lines are drawn just as a means to establish that it's a society that takes questions of morality seriously. So, we're just going to draw a line somewhere. I think many ethical questions admit a vagueness. We have a category of certain cases on either side of a very vague boundary. And there's a temptation sometimes to say, well, because there are these indeterminate cases, and so we have to draw boundaries somewhere, our boundaries necessarily unprincipled, and thus it's arbitrary and sort of meaningless, and it's just a matter of democratic discourse or something like that. And I think that's false. And I think we could think of some examples. So one that I talk about often in my undergraduate class on bioethics is age of consent, right? Whatever that age of consent might be, where you are, 18, 21, based on various things. The United States is kind of bizarre in that you can join the military before you can have a beer, but that's a question for another day. Everybody will admit that nothing magically happens on your 18th birthday. It's not like the day before you're 18, you're incompetent, and the day you turn 18, you're not. What we do recognize is a gradation of competency, and for certain issues in which it's not feasible to make very precise determinations, we have to pick some spot in the zone of vagueness and draw that as our line as a way of protecting ourselves from doing things that are morally impermissible. But that doesn't mean that there aren't clear cases, but because there's gradation of competency, it doesn't mean that there aren't clear cases where somebody's incompetent and clear cases where somebody is competent. We're just stuck with this intractable problem of fine-grained precision. And I think that we see that all the time, and I think that we should resist the temptation to think that these are just arbitrary or there is no correct answer. In my statement I made earlier, I was defending a version of moral realism, right? That there are true and false things in morality, just like there are true and false facts about the world. And I think that I think even if you hold a view like that, you can admit, and we should be humble and admit that we can make mistakes, and we can draw the line in the wrong place. So these lines always have to be revisable. And when we set the line, we have to set the line also knowing that we may have been mistaken, or maybe we're doing the best job we can at the time. And once we gain more knowledge, gain more insight, both moral insight and insight about facts about the world, we can revise that position. And I think that we can apply that kind of thinking to something like the 14-day rule. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment to make, Reuven, on what you said, and possibly a question to push in that direction. But I also have a question for Rosemarie. On your point, Reuven, I actually had the benefit of talking to Mary Warnock about the Warnock report. Sorry to pull rank in a sense, or pull age, or whatever. And she did indeed confirm that when she took on the chairmanship of that, or the chair of that committee, the committee well understood that the British government needed a line, any line, and that was the purpose of what. And she said to me with a twinkle in her eye that it was good that there were these dissenting voices who were Catholics, because the Catholics had been included in the deliberation, and of course it was known that they were going to dissent, but the very fact of there being a dissent added more legitimacy to the conclusion of the report, because it showed that there had been something like deliberation. But the point about right and wrong, I mean, aren't you conflating two different levels of rightness and wrongness when you say that? I mean, as if there is an epistemically correct place that the 14 days is correct biologically or according to some other fact of nature, when in fact there is a different kind of rightness, which is that the line was arrived at in accordance to what the British government and public agreed was an appropriate form of deliberation, which wasn't just the committee report, it was the subsequent legislative deliberations and the eventual enactment of an act of parliament that ratified the 14 days and set up the HFEA that you were talking about, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. So it was not that a biologically correct 14 days at the time, because we didn't know enough, now becomes a biologically incorrect 14 days because now we can keep the embryo alive for longer, and the black box that Jacob was talking about no longer needs to stay closed at 14 days but can extend subtly to 28 days or whatever. I mean, that leaves the judgment of rightness entirely in the hands of a biologically determined correctness of up to what time is it right to intervene in early embryological development with scientific means. But there was this added other sense of rightness, namely that the British public by and large went along with the view that, yes, it makes common sense that there should be a line, and the appearance of the primitive streak and the specialization of the frontal and the dorsal sides of the embryo, that these made sense as good biological markers. For a change to happen, there would have to be a further agreement of the same sort, that yes, now that we want to, that we can do certain things that science didn't allow us to do before, the sort of combined rightness of the right deliberation and the right biology may or may not lead to a different set of things. But surely not just that we were wrong about the 14 days epistemically and now are right epistemically. It was always a hybrid. So I don't know what you would make of that kind of argument. But the thing I wanted to ask Rosemarie was that implicit in what you were suggesting is that one may want to question even the prime mandates of public health and medicine about the do no harm, because it raises questions about from whose standpoint are you judging the harm doing, and that implicit in your Down syndrome story with the, I mean, actually it raises somewhat the same question as I was asking before, because does a Nordic country have the right to declare that Down syndrome is a disease and therefore ought to be eradicable without taking into into account the subjective experience of the parents and children who are suffering from this condition and their self-understanding of what that particular mode of suffering, if suffering it is worth in a society. So in highly socialized forms of government where the state and the public till are paying for the care of people, you could see that there might be an exogenous and quite cost-benefit oriented calculation that we do not want to care for these people because they cost extra money, but that may not be sufficient to override the sense of families with Downs in their progeny, that actually it is a total moral good for that family unit or for that society to tolerate a certain kind of variation. I mean, so our questions might be, are there disease conditions where we would not want autonomy about deciding, yes, we want to live with this condition? And how do we arrive at those absolute positions, that this is an absolute bad for everybody or sufficiently universal, that eradication is the answer, and not living with, which might be more consistent with a cosmopolitan ethics approach to the very idea of suffering?
You're asking exactly the right question, of course. I don't know what kinds of deliberations went into the decisions and the announcement on the part of these Nordic countries that they had eliminated Down syndrome as a disease. But of course, these are countries that have social medicine and social support, so economic considerations may certainly have been brought to bear in the decisions about how to characterize Down syndrome as a disease rather than a human variation. That said, I think we have there are really important questions of fairness about resource distribution. For example, it's often argued that the money that is put forward to support research, for example, to eliminate certain kinds of diseases, might be better spent creating a better social safety net for people who have these conditions, and to invest that money in making better lives for people with these conditions. So those are really important questions. I think there's another example that might be brought forward that's really interesting we haven't talked about, and that is the practice of euthanasia that is so very widespread in Belgium and the Netherlands and Switzerland, and that is soundly rejected in the UK and in Germany, and more or less in the United States, even though there are increasing numbers of states that permit euthanasia, which we don't ever call it euthanasia here in the United States. We call it things like physician-assisted suicide or various other language, but it's called suicide rather than euthanasia. But what's rather remarkable is, even though, as I said, there are more states that are making what we call assisted suicide legal, it has not been taken up at all in the way that it has been taken up in the Netherlands and Belgium and Switzerland. And it's very interesting to think about the framework of why that happens in terms of ethics and morality and public conversation. And we don't have to analyze that, but it's just another really good example of how different social structures and different, I think, histories of societies shape the kinds of ethics the kinds of morality that that we have that govern scientific medicine and its practices and regulations.
Do you want to add on?
Yeah, I'd like to just respond to the comments about my take on the 14-day rule. So I think there was some rationale, I think, behind the 14-day rule, and I know that the idea of individuation was taken very seriously. At what point can we be certain that we have an individual and not something that might subdivide or turn into twins or things? And that was part of the motivation. And so there was an empirical basis for why, at a certain point, we have something identifiable as an individual. And of course, those are questions that we could be right or wrong about, and our decisions can change. And so I think there is, now of course, I never had the opportunity to speak to the original authors of the report or the committees involved, but from what I've read about it, there was rationale and justification, and we can assess the correctness of at least some of the empirical claims that underlie where this line was drawn, and we can reconsider them. And we ought to reconsider them in the face of new evidence. The question about two kinds of right. So we can arrive at a position that is politically correct in the sense that it has followed the appropriate political procedures such that it's consistent with the Constitution and other laws governing the passage of regulation. And that's true. That's a very separate question from whether the decision is in fact morally correct. And of course, there's a separate question about how we ought to respond when those decisions are or are not morally correct. In some instances, we do think that people should just resist politically correct but immoral decisions. So, for example, a state can, through completely politically correct means, instigate a war against another country and draft people to fight in that war. And we might think that people in those circumstances ought to resist what is in fact demanded of them by a completely politically correct decision. So in a certain sense, yes, there are two kinds of right. What I was concerned about is the moral boundary, and of course there's a separate question of how we ought to behave when the moral boundary and the political rule, the rule that was determined by the correct political process are in tension with each other. And that's a complicated question. It's going to vary case by case. I think we all, in a certain sense, end up supporting rules that we think are immoral in some sense, right? I mean, I think that the US's mass incarceration system is terribly morally problematic. And when I pay tax, my money goes to support that. So should I be not paying taxes? These are complicated and difficult questions. But I guess I see there is a sense in which we might be talking about right in two separate ways when we're engaging this debate.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that I don't buy exactly what you're saying about politically correct. Not that that term isn't charged enough by itself.
Sorry, that was a poor choice of
anyway,
terms.
But this is not a point about conforming to preordained political process. I mean, in fact, the Warnock Committee was operating itself in a gray zone and did not know what the process would end up being. And the process went through several iterations because of the controversial character of the proceedings. So it's not that there was a process laid out in advance. The correctness, in a way, was an after-the-fact judgment that what emerged was something that people were prepared to live with, because they felt it had been deliberated in a way that they culturally understood to be adequate for the purposes. And that is a different form of correctness from obeying rules. I think it goes back to what Rosemarie was saying about why certain cultures might approve of something that's physician-assisted premature dying, and other cultures might not. But that it's not a matter of rule book following correctness. It's a matter of political judgment that this was an adequate deliberative process.
Should we go to the next question here?
Hi, and this has been a fascinating day for me because this isn't the way I usually think, and the terminologies you're using and the way you're thinking about things are just, kind of, massaging my brain a little bit, or maybe beating it up a little bit. But I just wanted to, kind of give a different perspective, maybe, in terms of these discussions. So, I'm coming from the side as a practicing surgeon physician, and then now a funding agency that seeks to advance science. And it was, as per that, I'd love to hear the whole genesis of that cartoon and the interpretation, but for good or bad, and I think mainly good, that there was a formation of an agency that advanced scientific innovation that went, through a process of public discourse and debate, but then ended up with a decision to fund this effort in order to advance human health. So fundamentally, as the head of an agency now, migrating my role from with treating patients directly to executing on this desire of the public to pursue this, our mission is driving everything we do. And the mission is to deliver transformative therapies to patients with the presumption that the science will enable us to do good and to solve human diseases, untreatable conditions. And then so when we discuss things upstream from that in terms of the steps in getting there, from the discovery to the translation to the clinical trials to the treatments, along the way there are going to be checks and balances according to the ethics committees, the FDA, the standard societies, and all that we should continue to have this. And what I'm hearing, I think, is really important. There is no right answer, right? But it's a matter of making sure that we hear a diversity of perspectives and thought and fair representation. So here's a challenge: is when is that enough? 12-member committee may not be enough. What is the most effective way to gain that input, and what is feasible, and how do we not inhibit progress by trying to have the right discussions? I think narratives are incredibly important. Where do they fit in to the whole process of making sure that the right evaluation of potential treatments is done in that can be measurable and reproducible and trackable to make sure there's no harm, right? So I'm raising more questions, but then, so that's why I just, I think it's so important to have these discussions, but then I always kind of say, okay, so how can we do things better so that these types of, considerations are brought to bear in terms of, there is no perfect. So the Warnock discussion is really interesting because it's a very hot topic, obviously, in the scientific community as well as all in different circles. But the fact that there was one, through whatever process it went through, was a signal to continue, right? Was a signal, yes, with these limits, because we've had this discussion, keep going forward. And I would love to, as a community, figure out, can we arrive at what is the big picture? What do we agree is the right thing to go toward? So that along the way, we can evaluate, is it time to reconsider? Have things changed? And should we stop it altogether, right? And so that's from a big picture, right? Obviously, from the role that I play, it'll be continue to drive responsible, ethically, and medical responsible research forward. But nevertheless, I think that your points and all of the things that I'm learning today, I feel so much more informed, is so important. And I wanted to just acknowledge that, and also get some practical things that I can bring back to my stakeholders to say, maybe we should incorporate that in our processes as well. Thank you.
What's remarkable, I think, given the last few comments, is that this idea of cosmopolitan ethics, of course, lives in public institutions, but also in newly formed committees like the Warnock Report, at least at that time new, in civil society. Internationally, these pop up in really maybe potentially initially disparate domains such as life and death or disease and healthy, but they could be linked to inform all of these different difficult questions. Any comments? I mean, we haven't really touched too much about institutions, I think, or focused in on that as a site and a locus of producing and reimagining cosmopolitan ethics. That could be maybe there's some reflection there on whether that's a productive site or one of the best sites to start to constitute this ideals and ideas that we have about cosmopolitan ethics.
I have a question before you. I think it'll fit in with what you're
Okay,
doing.
great. Go ahead.
And that is, so I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, again, different point of view, but we sit in rooms and we have very brilliant people who make decisions about what's ethical and what's right and what should be done. And we come up with very well-meaning things like guidelines or reports, which then, when it comes to health, get turned into sometimes legislation, sometimes other types of things, which are actually affect people's lives. And there doesn't seem to be anything in the process to think about what that means at the point of service or the point of care. And what I'm thinking about now was the report on the misuse of opioids. And that was done from a parent's heart. The director of the CDC, son, had a problem. He looked at it. He had a lot of money. He had friends' influence, and they wrote this report. And this report went out in the world. And under the guise of cosmopolitan ethics, it was, we have to do something about that, and we need to put some things in place. And what we've got in place now is where patients are going to the hospital and really needing pain care, and the very people they have to go to for care are now having to make the decision about whether or not the person A is really sick or not, or B, is it better to let the person suffer with pain than be a drug addict? And the other thing is, if I really want to treat their pain and I don't follow along with these guidelines, then I could lose my job. So again, here, clearly we can all agree, pill mills were no good. People were dying. People are still dying. We need to do something. But in our discussions about ethics and what needs to happen, again, when it goes wrong or we have enough evidence to say that heading this way was not right, that isn't clearly the thing to do, do we have a mechanism, right, for correction or to revisit? And I think surely with as fast as cell and gene therapy is going, we need to be thinking about that. Unlike other times when things were going a bit slowly, we might have had more time to turn things around. But I think we really need to be aware of that. And so I'll let you, please, in your groups and your brilliance, let's discuss that.
Can I say a few quick things? I think in response to both questions. I think what kind of goes along with humility about and fallibility about decision making is that mechanisms of revisability have to be built into the policies we put forward. Policy is always blunt. It's always hard for a particular policy to take in all the details of a particular situation, and there's always going to be costs where whenever we have a kind of blanket policy on anything, that we're going to err in some cases on one side and in other cases on the other. So I think while in the process of crafting guidelines and policies, we should take on board the fact that these policies are not going to stand for all eternity. We likely are going to have to make amendments, and we ought to reconsider the position. And I think one way to do this is formal sort of sunset clauses on regulation, where there's a status quo bias. Once there's a rule, it's much harder to change the rule than it is, than it would have been to amend it at the outset. And so I think one way to deal with that is just sunset clauses, force people to reconsider the decision at a certain point in time. And I think that's sort of a practical suggestion that could be more widely employed to help us deal with some of these problems. Yeah.
Well, just a quick response to that. I would worry that sunset clauses are a pretty blunt instrument to deal with a blunt instrument. So that makes me worried. But
Fair enough.
But let me say, I mean, I think that this point about correction is a crucial point. Mechanisms for correction. To that, I would add mechanisms for learning, which are tightly coupled, and maybe expand it to or qualify it as, at the most sort of expansive level, mechanisms of democratic correction. So, Maria, in a sense, your question, as I take it, is sort of what's enough? Do you need a committee of 14 or of 40 or 400 or 4,000 or 400,000 or when is it 4 million, 40 million? Yeah, we can keep going. Sort of when is enough? I think that this is a very simple-minded comment, but there's a very important distinction between delegated governance and appropriated governance, and the committee of 14 that in effect appoints itself and declares itself the right committee by virtue of its expertise or whatever imagination of representation it's operating with is appropriated governance, not delegated governance. But there are many things for which, in late modern societies, we say, let's not all try to solve this problem together. Let's give it to the department that monitors water quality, or to the FDA, or to the whatever, delegated governance, where there are terms of authorization and there are hopefully mechanisms of correction and what we call accountability, which should be more fulsomely understood than it tends to be, that invite forms of scrutiny and ongoing deliberation and entail a kind of provisionality that doesn't have a built-in blunt instrument of revisability, but even our sacred Constitution is revisable in principle. It's just not so easy to do. But that's part of the it's a design feature. Anyway, I think that if one starts with that question, what is the delegation upon which this structure of governance is built, and is it a good one? Is it a robust one? What are the politics of authorization? We might actually look at these, at powerful institutions differently, and also at the ways those institutions justify their own power. And I think especially in the domain of biomedicine, where a lot of the justification is self-justification. We know the disease. We know we know you don't. To maybe contend with something a little bit uncomfortable, since you're from CERM, sorry. In the politics of CERM has done and continues to do many really excellent things, and yet, if one looks back at the moment of its creation and authorization, they relied very heavily on the political voices of people affected by very serious diseases, where the coalition was formed around the promise that if this funding comes through in 5 years, you'll be cured. Now, it was said repeatedly, and I have a whole file full of quotes from people who were involved in this who say, well, if this doesn't happen, there's going to be hell to pay. But these are people who are, in effect, forgotten people when they cease to be useful. And there was no hell to pay because they lost their soapboxes 5 years afterwards when the goods weren't delivered. And that is not, it seems to me, a robust promise upon which to build authorization and delegation for what are otherwise very virtuous undertakings. And it is the risk, the temptation of availing oneself of that easy authorization that makes, that taints the enterprise and indeed produces and solidifies things like this, which to me are corrosive to democracy. And, we're seeing in the last few years what what the corrosion to democracy that we have effected over the last few decades is producing for us, and it's a pretty disturbing thing.
Well, I think we have time for very brief closing comments. Would you like to start, Rosemarie? 30 seconds or so.
I just want to emphasize something that I think underlies many of the conversations that we've had here today, and that is to use the terms from bioethics, harm and benefit. It's very difficult to adjudicate and to disentangle harms and benefits and to treat them as if they are two separate things, when in fact almost every action or every human circumstance has both a harm and a benefit that are entangled in one another. And this is what makes it so very difficult for us to move forward with policies, practices, and regulations that do in fact support something like the admirable goal of cosmopolitan ethics.
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to emphasize from my point of view is just the importance of, if we're going to take this view of cosmopolitan ethics, that we treat everybody with the respect they deserve, and that means paying attention to how different kinds of technologies and developments might affect people in desperate ways. And I think that's a really good reason for why we should be looking for breadth when we're doing public consultation, try and cast the net wide and not really focus on just a numbers game, but are we actually representing the diversity of kinds of lives when we're crafting policy?
Yeah, so I'll just say that I think this panel and the concept at the center of this panel is an aspiration. Its central aspiration is that we, as we conceive it, has less of a them than it might have otherwise, and that this conversation has very much been in that spirit. So thanks a lot.
Let's thank our panel once again.